In this video, we're going to cover the following topics: prerequisites to perform the IP phone firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP, also known as 3PCC, with classic licensing using a local Tftp server. Number 2, workflow demonstration of performing the firmware migration from Enterprise to MPP using a local Tftp server. And last item, troubleshooting considerations. To perform a firmware migration using a local Tftp server from Enterprise firmware to MPP firmware, ordering classic licenses is a requirement. And on this chart right here, we see there's two different licenses that can be ordered. If we're using an 8800 series phone, then it'll be the top part number we want to order, L-CP-E2M-88XX-CNV equal symbol. If we're using a 7800 series phone, it will be L-CP-E2M-78XX-CNV equal symbol. There's a very good document. If you look at this URL at the bottom, this is a white paper document that talks about firmware migration on the IP phones. This document gets updated from time to time. It has actually quite a lot of detailed information. One thing you want to be careful of is it's very easy to order the improper part number. So for example, if you're going to be using the Cisco phone for third-party call controller or WebEx calling, for example, then you want to make sure you're ordering the phone that is known as 3PCC or MPP. That's for a third-party call controller. If the phone is going to be for usage with CUCM, then you want to order the Enterprise version. In any case, you want to go and take a look at this document before making any type of orders to minimize any issues of ordering the wrong phone. In this specific video, the focus is going to be using a local Tftp server to do their firmware migration. When you're using classic licenses, which is basically, we're assuming that you're purchasing the classic licensing for the firmware migration, the method that most folks use, and it's the easiest method, is there's something called Cisco Cloud Upgrader. You basically would upload these licenses to the Cisco Cloud Upgrader site, and you would basically perform the firmware migration using the Cloud Upgrader. However, if you have a situation where that may not be possible, your environment is air-gapped, meaning it has no internet access, and everything is on-premise, and you're using the classic licenses, then this might be the method you're looking to use as a local Tftp server. And again, just to reiterate, this method is only supported if you have purchased classic migration license from Enterprise to 3PCC. And a license is required per each phone for the migration. And then this link kind of goes into the details about a lot of different topics related to firmware migration from Enterprise to 3PCC and vice versa. One important item is, if you run into issues, which technical support team do you need to contact? And there's really, in this case, 3 different teams you should be aware of as far as technical support resources if you do run into issues during your workflow process of doing the firmware migration from Enterprise to 3PCC. So if you have any type of subscription-based issues, retrieving licenses from a subscription type of entitlement, then the team you would want to contact is going to be the Cisco Entitlements team. and this is the actual URL right here. If you just purchased the classic licenses that we talked about a moment ago for the firm migration, and you're having issues with that purchase as far as you're not getting the licenses or having issues registering the MAC addresses to the license pack that you received via email, then you would want to go ahead and open up a case with a global licensing operations team, and the URL would be right here for those folks. And then the last tech support team would be if you're physically having issues with the phone itself. So for example, the phone's not getting a DHCP IP address, the phone is having issues attaching to the proper VLAN, you're having issues resetting the phone to factory default, etc., etc. You'd want to contact the small business support team, and basically you would go to this URL right here to open up a case for that team as far as the physical phones, issues related to the physical phones. And there's one very important item or question, and I'm going to read this verbatim. My customer purchased the wrong phone type and needs to migrate the phone to the call controller they have. Can we do this? And it says her answer, no, please contact point of sales to return the phones and order proper phones for the customer. Cisco will not replace phones or migrate phones for the customer for customers that make a mistake when ordering the phones. So definitely you want to take time and look at the data sheet and any other related documents to the phones and or your call controller platform to make sure you're purchasing the right phones, because this can be a very costly mistake and also can be a very time-consuming mistake, especially if you have a large number of phones. In any case, this information that we've been talking about, this slide and the previous slide, is actually based upon information in the document located at this URL. Definitely apply some time looking at this document if you're going to be doing any type of firmware telephony migration. Again, there's a lot of information, and it's very easy to run into issues if you're not aware of different caveats. Okay, one of the things that we need to look at is not all of the hardware phones may be eligible for the firmware migration from enterprise to MPP firmware. So there's a chart, and again, this is the same URL as the last page we looked at, is a white paper right down here, this URL, and it has a chart that talks about which hardware phones are eligible for the firmware migration from enterprise to MPP. This document does get updated from time to time. So at the time you're viewing this video, things may have changed versus what I'm showing here. So you definitely want to go and view this document at this link to make sure you're viewing the most current information that's applicable for the hardware upgrade from enterprise to MPP. But in any case, at the time of the recording of this video, the one thing I would point out, for example, is if we look at the 7821 phones, also the 7841 phones, and also the 7861 phones, notice that they have a special hardware requirement. The hardware on the 7821 phone must be version 3 or later. On the 7841, the hardware must be version 4 or later, and the 7861 hardware must be version 3 or later. Otherwise, the firmware migration is not going to be supported. So be aware of that. Also, there's some additional notes here. You can go ahead and stop the video and read those details if you like, if it's applicable to your specific scenario. Okay, so as far as the firmware migration from enterprise to 3PCC via local TFTP server, there's going to be actually two phases that this needs to happen in. So for phase 1, we're going to have a folder on our TFTP server set up where it's going to hold what is known as transitional firmware. And the way you know it's transitional firmware, in the middle of the name of the firmware, it's going to have TLEXE2M, and that signifies it's transitional firmware from enterprise to MPP. And then I'll show what version it is, and you know, it is specific to the models of phones, so that's another thing to be aware. Is one question that might come up is, where do you get this firmware, this transitional firmware from? Because if you go and you do some searching online or you go to the Cisco site and you search under the phones, you'll have a very difficult time finding the transitional firmware. And the reason being is this is something that you'll receive a special link when you purchase the classic firmware migration licenses we talked a few pages earlier. In the entitlement email that you get for the licensing, there'll be a link where you actually would go and download the transitional firmware. So once you download the transitional firmware, you want to put on your TFTP server, the folder, the root folder, and I basically just expanded there, and I leave this folder the name as you see here. And then within a folder, we'll have basically, in this case, it has 5 different files that are files related to the binaries. The main file that we'll be interested in here, we'll talk about in a few slides, is going to be this file that ends with a .loads. And what the file does, it actually instructs the phone. That'll be the first file that the phone actually ingests as far as the binaries go, and it instructs the phone what specific binaries it needs to fetch from this folder for the firmware migration to the transitional firmware. So basically, once it ingests the .loads file, it knows it needs to sequentially go and download the rest of these files, the binaries files, if you will, here. And then another key file that is not part of the transitional firmware download, it's a zip file that you download, but is not part of it, is this XML file. It's called Xmldefault.cnf. And this is a file that actually is sourced from CUCM. It's a default file that has basically listings for all the different phones or telephony devices that CUCM supports, and it instructs what actual binary or firmware load the phones should actually fetch from the TFTP server. And so this is something towards the end of the video I'll kind of talk about, and I'll have a detailed illustration what it's composed of, this XML file. But this is something that's needed to be placed in a folder because the enterprise phones, their web GUI is locked, and even if you had a phone that the web GUI was unlocked, it's still really a read-only type of web GUI, meaning you can look at statistics and items of that nature, but it's quite different than the 3PCC firmware. So it is very important that we have the Xmldefault.cnf file, because that's what's going to instruct the phone to go ahead and load the .loads file, so the file right above here. And then once the phone ingests the .loads file, then it knows it needs to ingest all the other binaries that you see above here listed. So in any case, that's going to be phase 1. That's going to take a few minutes to complete. Phase 2, which will be this bottom folder right here, that's going to be the final 3PCC firmware. So we're going to create a secondary folder on our TFTP server, and this is something you can actually find in the Cisco website. It's not a hidden URL. It does require that you have an active CCO account that is eligible for downloads of this binary. But in any case, you want to find the most current 3PCC binaries for your specific phone. In this example, we're using the 8832 speakerphone, or conference room phone, if you will. And when we unzip this, we'll basically get all these different binaries you see here. So we basically have 4 different binaries. They're signed binaries. That's what they're called, SBIN. And then we have the .loads file. Again, the .loads file will be a critical file because this is what the phone's going to use kind of as a ledger to know what binaries it needs to actually fetch. But another important file here is going to be the license file, and that's this file right here. So this is what we're calling the classic license, or what is being called classic license. So this must be in a folder. It must be the license that you register for the MAC address for your phone. If this is not here, if it's the wrong MAC address, if it was tampered with, basically if there's something wrong with it, you'll get an error message on the phone stating it's not authorized for firmware migration, and basically that's where things are going to stop. So definitely something you want to make sure you have this. It's correct. The MAC address is correct. When you actually registered your MAC address to the PAC file when you order the licensing, also make sure it's the proper model number. Because if you've registered a wrong model number, it is also not going to work. So in any case, this will be phase 2. So again, the game plan is we're first going to go ahead and have the phone go into this transitional firmware. And then once it's in the transitional firmware, we're going to go back into the TFTP server, and we're going to point the TFTP server so its root folder now is going to be ready for phase 2. So phase 1, the root folder is this, what you see right up above here. Then once it's completed and we verified on the phone indeed is running the TLEXE2M firmware, then we're going to go back to the TFTP server and we're going to make the adjustments. So now the root folder is pointing to the actual 3PCC firmware we downloaded from the Cisco site that's appropriate for our model phone, and also we've included the license file within the same folder. Okay, so here we're basically looking at the transitional firmware folder. So this again would be phase 1. And the two most important files in this folder is going to be the Xmldefault Cnf file, because this is what's going to tell the phone which actual binary or .loads file the phone needs to download from the TFTP server. And then when the phone downloads this .loads file, it knows actually what specific binaries it needs to fetch from the TFTP server. So both of these are very important. And basically, if we open up the Xmldefault.cnf file, what we need to do is we need to modify one line, and that's going to be the line for our specific model of phone that we're doing the firmware migration. So in this example, we're using the 8832 speakerphone or conference room phone. And we know, based upon the transitional firmware we downloaded, that the .loads file is this SIP 8832.TLEX-E2M-11-3-4C-330.loads. And what you're going to notice is we're going to basically go ahead and copy the file name. However, we will leave out the .loads extension. So the .loads extension is not needed because the phones already know that this file that we're putting here, the file name, is already the .loads iteration of the file, if you will. So in any case, we do need to modify that. In this case, I'm using Notepad++. It works excellent for XML and a lot of other file formats. Update that, save that, so now this Xmldefault.cnf file is prepped and ready to go. By the way, this Xmldefault.cnf file, it was actually sourced from CUCM version 14. You can also use older versions, but in this case, the item I ran into is the older versions I had did not have the 8832 phone in them, because this is a newer phone. So based upon the vintage of phone that you're doing their firmware migration, you could use older versions like CUCM 12, .x or CUCM 10.x as far as the CNF default or XMLdefault.cnf file, but it's going to really be based upon the vintage of phone if it's going to be listed in that file or not. This case with the newer phone, CUCM 14 has 8832 and is what we need for this firmware migration. Okay, so for phase one, basically, we're going to make sure that the TFTP server, so basically we would go ahead and click on Browse, and then the specific TFTP server I'm using is TFTPD64. There's also 32-bit version. You can use either or, because these binaries are not super big, and either version works fine. But in any case, we want to browse to the actual folder that has a transitional firmware, and that's basically what we're showing here. We hit browse, we point to this folder. That folder, if we look at the left-hand side here, has the contents. Again, we have the Xmldefault.cnf file here we talked about a moment ago. And then the other important file we have here is the downloads file, because that gives us kind of a listing, or gives the phone the listing, all the binaries it needs to ingest into itself, which are above here. And then towards the bottom here, and I mentioned this a few moments ago, but I'm going to highlight it one more time. The download link for the transitional firmware will be sent via email when you buy the classic firmware migration license and register the MAC address of your phone. So that is very critical. You want to make sure that's completed so you can actually get the email. They'll have actually the download link. It'll also have some additional information related to the process, etc., etc. But again, something that's needed. Otherwise, if you just try to search for the transitional firmware, basically you're going to come up empty-handed, because it's not a link that's really listed on the public site. Okay, so the next item we want to look at is, we know we have the TFTP server set up. We have the folder for the transitional firmware set up. We know we have the proper transitional firmware binaries, including the download file we talked about. We have the needed XML file from CUCM, where we prepped it for the specific line for the 8832, so it's pointing to the correct downloads for transitional firmware. And the only thing left to do really is to go into the telephony user interface, also known as the TUI. So that's basically going to be the LCD screen on your phone. And what we want to do is, on the phone itself, we want to go to number 5, which will be settings. Then we want to go to number 4, which is admin settings. Then we want to go to number 1, which is network setup. Then again, we want to go to number 1, which is Ethernet setup. And then the next one, again, will be number 1 for IPv4 setup. And then within the IPv4 setup, we want to go down the menu until we hit number 12, which will be alternate TFTP. And we want to make sure it's on for alternate TFTP. And then for TFTP server 1, we're going to type in the IP address of our local TFTP server. In my example, my local TFTP server, or my PC that's running the TFTP server software, is at .50, so 192.168.2.50. And then basically, you'll just go ahead and hit apply here, and it'll take a few moments for it to go ahead and start processing that. But basically, while the phone is doing that, what you'll see is activities as far as, it'll go ahead and fetch the default.cnf file at one point of time. This will instruct the phone to go ahead and fetch the downloads file right here, which we talked about. And once the phone fetches the downloads, then it'll go ahead and sequentially fetch all these other files, all these other assigned binary files for this phone. And the whole process typically takes a few minutes. It's not very long. But in any case, this is all done in clear text. So if the phone is having any issues finding the files, you can definitely, at least with the TFTP server I'm showing you here, this varies between different TFTP servers, but with this specific TFTP server has a tab on it called Log Viewer, and it'll actually tell you exactly what's happening here. If it's having issues finding the Xmldefault Cnf file, the Xmldefault.cnf file, or if it's having issues finding the actual downloads file, etc., etc. if your TFTP server does not have a easy viewable log viewer tab or file, if you will, within a TFTP server to view the log, then you can also run Wireshark either on the TFTP server, or you can do a port mirror. Source port on your switch would be where the phone's located at. Destination port would be a PC with Wireshark. Since it's clear text, you can just run it. You can do a filter in the display filter field within Wireshark for TFTP, and then in real time you can view and see what's going on. You want to view the payload of the packet, layer 7, and very quickly figure out if it's getting stuck, if it's timing out, what the issue might be. Okay, and then basically during this process you will see the LCD change. There'll be a reboot, then you'll see the logo as you see on the screen here, and then once it's completed, you'll see some more information listed in log here. And at the end of this process, typically I would say it's probably like 3 to 5 minutes. But in any case, you will run into this error, and this is actually normal, because once you complete phase 1 of the firmware migration, now the actual phone is running the transitional firmware, and it's looking now for the 3PCC firmware, and it's also going to be looking for the license file. So at this point of time, we want to go ahead and make an adjustment on the actual TFTP server to get it prepped for phase 2. And we'll look at that here next. Okay. And one thing you should definitely check, just as a sanity check, is go into the actual phone itself and verify under product information using the telephony user interface, basically the LCD on the phone, and verify that the actual firmware kernel on the phone is the TLEX E2M firmware, that it's the transitional firmware. And so now we know we're in a state on the phone that we need to move into phase 2 of the firmware migration. Okay, so phase 2, we're going to basically point the TFTP server to the folder that actually has the 3PCC binaries, and it also has a license file. So here's the license file we talked about earlier, and then these are going to be the 3PCC binaries. The critical file here is going to be the .loads file, and as of the recording of this video, the most current version is 11.3.5. Obviously, when you watch the video at a later date, the version most likely will be different, and you would want to use the latest version. Also, look at the documents, review the documents in case the process has changed, the firmware migration using a local TFTP, etc., etc. But in any case, we're going to make sure now that the TFTP server is pointing to the folder that has the actual 3PCC firmware, and then we want to make sure the proper license file for the firmware migration from enterprise to 3PCC, known as the classic license, which needs to be purchased, is in the same folder. It's for the proper phone MAC address, and when this was registered online, when you bought the license and you received the PAC file, that the PAC information, that it was registered a proper model. That's also very critical, otherwise this will not work. Okay, so to initiate the phone to download the 3PCC firmware for phase 2 of the firmware migration, is we need to actually log into the phone itself. So you're going to basically take a web browser. I have Chrome here, type in the IP address of the phone itself. You're going to get basically a web interface of the phone as you see here. Don't let this fool you, because the phone does have transitional firmware, so it says 3PCC, but the phone is not ready at this point of time, because this is just a transitional firmware that the phone has. But in any case, what we're going to do is you want to go ahead and click on admin login, and then you want to click on advanced login, because we need to have both admin and advanced levels of access, and that's kind of what I show here. The reason being is we're going to actually instruct the phone here in a moment. The URL and the actual files that it needs to fetch from the TFTP server. So in any case, you notice when we clicked on admin, this now changes to user login, which is fine. It means we're currently admin. And then when we click on advanced, we're in advanced mode. And then once we're in admin/advanced mode, which we are right now, we want to click on the voice tab right here. And then once we're on the voice tab, we want to go to provisioning. And then under provisioning, we want to scroll down a page a tad here. And then we're going to get to a section that's listed as Firmware Upgrade. And there's two different types of fields we want to fill out. We want to fill out the upgrade role, so there'll be our TFTP server, so TFTP://192.168.2.50/SIP 8832.11-3-5 MPP 0001-276.loads. So we want to do the full name there. And then the second item we need to fill out as far as field is going to be the transitional load authorization role. And this is telling the phone where the actual license file is at. Because if you don't enter this in and you don't have the proper license file, it is not going to work. The firmware migration is not going to work. So in any case, we know we have it at the same TFTP server, so that's the same / and then the actual name of our license file, which is the MAC address of our phone, .lic. And then all we need to do is submit all changes by clicking this right here. Okay, and then the phone's going to go ahead and reboot after a couple seconds and start the process. And what you're going to see here is, I should say it's going to start the process, but it won't reboot until it's finished with the process. So what you're going to see on your phone is a message will come up that says transition and revision upgrades are authorized. So that is actually a good sign. It means it's actually gone out to the TFTP server, it's found the actual license file, and it's analyzed the license file to validate that it matches what it's looking for based upon MAC address, etc., etc. And that's all gone through A-OK, and now upgrade is in progress. Okay, and then you'll be seeing activity again. The TFTP 64, if you go under the log viewer tab, you'll be seeing different files being fetched from the server, etc., etc. What it's going to do is at the beginning, it's going to basically look at the .loads file and concurrently the lic file to make sure that it's authorized to do the firmware migration. And then once it completes this authorization, then the .loads file kind of gives us instructions to go in and download the rest of the assigned binaries that you see here. And this is going to take a few minutes, typically about roughly 5 minutes. If again you're having any type of performance limitations on the server or bandwidth between the server and the phone, it might be a little bit longer, but generally roughly about 5 minutes is what I would expect. And then you should see the phone now transition to where it says firmware upgrade in progress. And then during this process, you're going to see within the TFTPD application, every so often there'll be child windows will pop up and will actually show you as the individual binary files are downloaded. Kind of a horizontal status bar as far as indication where it's at. Then a phone's going to get to a stage where it's going to reboot once all the binaries are downloaded to the phone. And then during the boot up phase, at some point you'll see configuration check is in progress. This will take a few minutes. And then we'll get into runtime state where now the actual firmware is complete. So one of the things we want to take a look at is we want to go to settings, and you want to, just like anything, you want to inspect to make sure that indeed it has the 3PCC firmware and it's no longer in transitional. And it's pretty easy to do. Is one, if we look at the actual firmware the phone currently has, there's no transitional firmware within the name, as we saw earlier. And the other sign would be, if you notice now, the product name is CP-8832-3PCC. So those would be the two indicators that yes, it's completed, it's ready to be registered to your SIP server. And then you can also go back into the web interface of the phone, and if you go under status, so info tab, status, and then you can look at the product information. We can see it's a CP-8832 3PCC, and then we can look at the actual firmware it has. We notice the firmware here is MPP. As I mentioned earlier, the 3PCC, it's also known as MPP and vice versa, but in any case, there's no transitional name in the firmware as it was before. So right now, this is the firmware migration has been completed and is ready to be registered. One other thing I would like to note is if this is going to a platform, for example, if this is either being registered to WebEx calling or another platform similar, often those platforms will lock the actual web GUI of the phone. So what I'm showing you here assumes that the web GUI of the phone is not locked. But if it's locked, no problem. You can still use a telephony user interface, the TUI we looked at on a page a moment ago, as far as validating that the phone indeed is 3PCC and the phone is using the MPP or 3PCC firmware and it's not stuck in a transitional firmware, etc., etc. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the process on the phone itself. We're first going to see what the phone currently has with the enterprise firmware. Okay, we can see it's a 8832 phone. There's no 3PCC in the name. We're going to go down to the actual firmware. So it's enterprise firmware 12-8-1, SIP 8832. If you notice, there's no MPP in the firmware name. Okay, we're going to take a look at the actual folder that has the transitional firmware. We're going to go ahead and point to the folder via the TFTP server. So that's going to be for the 8832 phone, the transitional firmware folder. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the contents of the folder. As we talked before, you notice there's the Xmldefault.cnf file. Again, that's very critical. That's what the phone's going to use to understand which binary .loads file it needs to fetch. And then once it downloads the .loads file, it'll know exactly what signed binary files that it needs to download. So at this point in time, we should be ready as far as the TFTP server goes. And we'll take a quick look here at the Xmldefault.cnf file using Notepad++. The specific phone we're going to be using for this firmware migration is going to be the 8832 speaker phone. And so we're making sure that we have the proper transitional load file listed within the XML file. And we'll just move this here a little bit on the side so we can make a side-by-side comparison. Okay. So if we look at here, so we have the SIP 8832.TLEXE2M, and if you notice, and the version number after that, if you notice, the matches exactly what we have in our folder. The .loads extension is not needed for this phase 1 step. So right now we look like we're in good shape regarding this. Okay, in the phone, we're going to go ahead and go down to the network setup, Ethernet setup, then IPv4 setup, and then we're going to go down towards the section to enable the alternate TFTP. So we're going to make sure it's on. Okay, we have TFTP server. We have the proper server ready entered in, which is 2.50. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at the actual TFTP server. Okay, we're seeing activity. It's already fetching the different files. Okay, it's now going and fetching the actual binaries. And this part actually goes quite quick. It's a few minutes and it should be completed. And once it completes this, the phone will reboot. If you are running into problems at this phase, you would want to take a look at the syntax under the log viewer under the tab that says log viewer within a TFTP server. If the TFTP server that you're using doesn't have a convenient log viewer mechanism to view the actual logs, as I mentioned earlier, we can also run Wireshark either on the TFTP server, or we can do a switch port mirror. Source port would be where the phone is plugged into the switch. Destination port would be where we plug in a computer with Wireshark, and we can just do a filter for TFTP, a display filter in Wireshark, and then look at the information within the payload of the TFTP packets to see exactly what the phone is trying to fetch versus what type of error message is being generated by the TFTP server. So typically troubleshooting is fairly straightforward regarding TFTP because everything's in clear text, and it's just a matter of looking at the syntax and seeing if was there maybe a typo, is the TFTP server pointing to the wrong folder, etc., etc. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the phone itself. Okay, ready to upgrade. Okay, and it's giving us a countdown. Device will restart in X amount of seconds. Okay, the phone is rebooting. We have the Cisco logo here. As we're waiting here, the other thing also is if your computer that's running the TFTP server has any type of firewall, either Microsoft firewall or other security software, please be aware it could be causing issues such as blocking the traffic. So that's another thing to look at is if there's nothing happening regarding the server log, definitely make sure that if there's personal firewall turned on, temporarily turn it off. If there's third-party security software on it, again, make changes as needed. Another method is if the system is locked, let's say it's a corporate image and you don't have admin rights, you may want to consider, and this might be a good idea as a plan B, having an additional computer that you can put TFTP on, or running a virtual machine, and then just a generic Windows 10 or whatever OS that you prefer. And from a generic standpoint, it doesn't have any special security rules, and running TFTP on that virtual machine. And then let's see, the phone should be finished here in a few moments, so we'll give it a few more moments. Okay, so this is expected message here that we're seeing, and the reason we're seeing the message is the phone is ready for phase 2, but let's take a quick look at the actual information of the phone to make sure it has the transitional firmware. Okay, so if you notice, it says TLEXE2M, so it has a transitional firmware. Also, the name says it's 3PCC, but at this point it's still on a transitional firmware, so it's not ready to be registered to a third-party call control, etc., etc. Okay, so we need to make a change here on the actual TFTP server. So we want to basically point the TFTP server to the folder that has the 3PCC binaries. And we're going to be using the binaries again for the 8832 phone. We're going to be using the latest binaries as a recording of this video, which is 11.3.5. And then we want to make sure we have the .lick file in the actual folder, because without the proper .lick file, this specifically tied to this MAC address of the phone for the enterprise to MPP migration, from migration it will not work. And then we also have the appropriate .loads file, as you can see right there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to need to go ahead and instruct the phone what to do next via the web interface of the phone. So we're going back to voice provisioning here in the phone, and then we're going to go down to the firmware upgrade section, and we're going to go ahead and so this will be the actual information for the upgrade role. So basically this is telling the phone we're using TFTP, the IP address of the actual server, and then the .loads. And then the next one is going to be the actual transitional load authorization role, and that's telling the actual phone where the actual license file is located. In this case, we actually have both the license file and the 3PCC binaries located on the same TFTP server. Just go ahead and visually inspect this to make sure everything matches. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the TFTP server now as it's performing the firmware migration. And if there's an issue with the license file, it would have actually stopped at this point. So right now it is continuing with the firmware migration from the transitional firmware over to the 3PCC firmware. This does take a little bit longer. This one's probably going to be 5+ minute area. It's not too long. What I was mentioning earlier was if you do run into issues with TFTP on your computer, and if your computer has a corporate image where it has it's locked down, and or you don't have admin rights, has special security software, etc., definitely have a plan B in mind. Either a spare computer that you use for the lab, or another computer that you use that doesn't have a corporate image, that's just kind of a generic Windows 10 image or whatever OS you're using. Another method also that comes in very handy is just running virtualization, like a Type 2 hypervisor that you run on top of the OS, VMware Workstation. There's also open source virtualization hypervisors out there, if you will, etc., etc. Because it is, if TFTP is not something that normally you're involved with as far as firmware upgrades and different type of IT equipment, it is very possible that you get stuck on the TFTP server software not functioning correctly. And you want to have a plan B always to be able to get around that issue. Okay, so we'll take a look at, okay, so it says transition and revision upgrades are authorized, upgrade in progress. Okay, it's excellent. So that's basically right there indication that it has actually analyzed the license file and everything's A-OK, and it's now going through the firmware migration from the transitional firmware over to the 3PCC firmware. If you don't get this, you want to analyze the log within the TFTP server and see exactly if there's any additional information. Is it not finding the lick file, or is it looking for a different lick file? Example, let's say the MAC address of your lick file is not the proper one for the phone. That may be a possibility. For whatever reason, maybe the wrong MAC address was entered in, or you copied the wrong .lick file, etc., etc. So it'll be very obvious there, because what the phone is trying to fetch versus what's in a folder does not match. The other item to also consider is if everything seems proper but the phone is still having issues, one thing you could always try to do is factory resetting the phone. I do have another video that talks about factory resetting phone. Basically, you disconnect the power. If it's PoE based, RJ45 unplug, hold the hash key number sign while applying power. Okay, firmware upgrade is in progress. Great. And then basically when the phone comes up and you see it'll vary a little bit, but you'll see some actual lights on the phone itself, like the speaker phone. It has a horizontal bar at the very top. It'll glow white. When that starts glowing white, you let go of the hash symbol, and then you do a sequential punch of all the keys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then the symbols towards the bottom of the keys, and then it'll factory reset it, and then go ahead and try the process again. It is possible, it's more of a corner case, but it is possible the phone might be stuck in some type of odd loop, if you will, or something, and it's never going through the full initialization for the firm migration. So that's something to try. If you tried once or twice and everything else looks A-OK, you're not seeing any indications in the log, or you're doing some Wireshark captures and there's no indications of why is it not, the firm migration is not going through, then that would probably be the next thing you want to do, is a factory reset on the phone. Okay, it says configuration check is in progress. This takes a few minutes, no problem. It's kind of at the final stages here of completing the firm migration. Okay, so right now we're in runtime, and we will go ahead and take a quick look here. Okay, so the first time you actually the phone boots up, and or you try to access the website first time, you get this password prompt. You want to just skip. You want to just press skip for right now, and then we're going to go down to status, and then we'll take a look at the product information. Okay, so if you notice in the software version, it is a MPP, aka 3PCC, so there's no transitional in the name, and also the actual name of the phone ends with a 3PCC. And then we can take a look at the same thing in the web GUI. Again, this assumes that the phone is not being registered to WebEx calling or another platform that locks the web GUI. But in any case, we'll take a look at basically same information but through the web GUI. Again, the firmware name does not have any transitional name of transitional firmware. It's MPP. And then also the name of the phone indicates 3PCC. So we should be in good shape. Okay, for the last item, we're going to take a look at the actual Xmldefault.cnf.xml file. So this is the actual file that needs to be in the folder for phase 1 of the TFTP server. So I'm just going to minimize this for a moment. So this is this file right here. For phase 1 of the firmware migration from enterprise to 3PCC using classic licenses, this is the actual file the enterprise phone firmware is going to look at to understand what firmware that loads file it needs to load up. So this was something that was actually sourced from CUCM, and the specific version I sourced this one from was CUCM 14, because the 8832 file, the 8832 speakerphone is a new speakerphone, and the older CUCM files for the Xmldefault.cnf file did not have the specific phone. But in any case, so I'm just going to scroll up slowly through this. This is something, if you do not have access to CUCM, you can stop the video and you can go ahead and generate this file from scratch if needed. So I'm just going to scroll this up, and I'm going to stop here for a few minutes. And what you're going to see, there's a lot of different telephony devices. There's obviously different phones in here, both skinny and SIP-based phones. There's also other devices here, such as telepresence units, etc., etc. And then we're just going to go up here slowly. So if you need to take a look at the file and reconstruct it, you can do so as needed. If you have a phone that is an older vintage phone, then most likely the if you have access to older CUCM, then that would be just fine. You can do a Control F and search for the specific phone you have. So we'll kind of continue going up here. So there's a number of different telepresence units. So we'll continue going here upwards. Okay, there's also some MGCP items in here. Okay, we'll continue going up here. Okay, some ATAs. And if you notice, there's the entry that we modified for the 8832. So it matches the transitional load that we wanted to load up for the firm migration. And we'll kind of continue going upwards here. Some more telepresence units listed. Okay, some skinny phone listed. Some SIP-based phones are listed. Okay, and then we kind of go towards the top here. Okay. Thank you for watching the video. Hopefully this helps you with a firmware migration using classic licenses to migrate an enterprise phone to 3PCC firmware using a local TFTP. Hopefully your migration workflow is a bit easier with this video. Good luck. Again, thank you for watching.